Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Catalina Auromar Natural Processed Panama from Meow Coffee Roastery. And there's the bag right there. And Meow, based out of Tsing, Hong Kong. And this is their third ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed a couple of their Panamanian geishas towards the end of last year. And truth be told, I wasn't the biggest fan of either of the two coffees that we did review from them. So when I found out Airworks was bringing them back in, we decided to go ahead and purchase this coffee, as our Asian coffee roaster tier list is just around the corner. And this felt like a great opportunity to see if this might improve where we're going to place them on that tier list. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 28. And a couple of quick notes before we start. This was a 100 gram bag of coffee, so it will be a slightly shorter review. In addition to that, given that we did have a little bit of familiarity with them and their profile, we did feel comfortable stirring this coffee a little earlier than we normally would. And for that reason, we did start at the day 14 mark and are already complete when it comes to the review for this one. Now, recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. So the best contemporary that we can compare them to is the other Hong Kong-based coffee roaster that we do feature on this channel a bit more regularly, and that is of course Oma, which is significantly lighter than what we experienced with all of the coffees that we have reviewed from Meow up to this point. Now in comparison, I would say that it's still a little lighter than the majority of the Japanese-based coffee roasters that we also review on this channel, but in comparison to, I would say, the majority of even American-based coffee roasters, it does feel a little bit more on the developed side of things. So I could say that this one either skews on the more developed side of a medium light, or maybe even on the lighter side of a true medium by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we opted for the V60. And as mentioned, the coffee was basically in line with the expectations, largely in terms of the roast profile, as it's not particularly light with some pretty prominent developed qualities to the coffee. That being said, there was a fair bit of depth, including a slight papery quality, which could be reminiscent of a tropical quality, as it is transitioning into a bit more of the listed butterscotch, which I definitely thought was an interesting note for this coffee. But that was largely the first impression that I did have with this one. A little bit more developed, definitely a bit more fermenty, and overall, I felt like there were some adjustments needed to this. Day 17 through the Chemex, and there was a pretty similar sentiment this time around, as it continued to remain strangely papery off brew, though it does seem to dissipate a little bit quicker today. There's more of a heavier chocolate feel and plenty of the tropicality, but not quite as fermenty. So first two impressions, not necessarily my favorite. As you can see, there are some characteristics to this coffee that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of. And going into it, I only have familiarity with one other Catalina Auromar coffee, and that is the one that we reviewed from Wesson Gopi, I want to say a little earlier this year, and I didn't necessarily have the best impression of that coffee either, so it could be safe to say that it's not necessarily my favorite coffee to begin with. We'll go ahead and move on to day 20 as we opted for the UFO brewer, and the coffee does continue to remain unusually papery with an unusual combination of what I would describe as rum-like booziness, but also a prominent candied quality that continues to remain in line with the listed butterscotch. And when you think of Panamanian geishas, that's not usually the first note that you think of, but given the processing of this one, the more boozy quality and component can be something a bit more in line with expectations, as it has been a bit fermenty overall with more of the tropicality giving it that rum-like feel. And I think the combination of the two, the fermentiness and the tropicality, did give it that slightly more, I want to say, banana rum sort of characteristic. Day 22 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so 15:1 at 92 degrees Celsius. And the coffee does continue to remain a bit tricky, as it still has plenty of the robust qualities to it, with the accompanying papery component as well. Berry quality is still present, but a little bit more toned down and less of the funky rum-like characteristics. So still more mixed results, as I haven't necessarily got the cleanest experience from any of the times that we have brewed this coffee yet. day 24 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it was definitely going to be interesting to see which direction we were going to go with this coffee, as there were still struggles with it as it continues to offer more of that papery quality throughout. It's slightly cleaner, largely because it doesn't have as much of the fermentiness, but rather a generic tropicality this time around. So haven't necessarily gotten great, I would say, definition, clarity throughout the entirety of this one. So on day 26, we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe. And the coffee was the best it had been to this point, so reverting back to our standard recipe, given that's kind of the best results I had had up to this point, did seem to pay off, as the trade-off for intensity and fermentiness did feel worth it when we pushed it. The tropical papery quality is still present with a bit more of the listed butterscotch, but less of the rum-like characteristics, which seemed to become a bit more abundant when we kept this coffee a little bit more toned down. So nothing I would necessarily say overly impressive in terms of the clarity on this one, but towards the end I kind of had to say that this is what we settled on for this coffee, and given that was the best results we had with it, we decided to kind of leave it there. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s actually, so let's go through those. We'll start with the finish level 4. The positive things I have to say about this coffee is that it didn't reach the overbearing sense regardless. So even though it was a little bit more fermenty and it was a little bit less clean overall, we were able to get some, I would say, even finish to it. And while it was offering strangely more of a candied butterscotch-like feel than I might have expected, I do think it was pretty decently balanced overall. So level 4 is where we opted to put that. Sweetness level 4. It does have a really nice candied quality to it, so I do have to give it credit for that at the very least. Outside of that, there's a lot of heavier fruit qualities to it, which I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of, and I do think that they translated into the overall sweetness of this coffee being on the higher side of things, so that's probably fully expected given what this coffee is. Acidity level 4, and this coffee definitely had a pretty strong brightness to it. And I have noticed that with a lot of processed coffees in general, especially something like this, that it can have a sharper than expected brightness overall, even with the development of it being a little bit higher. So level 4, where we opted to put that's a lot of the tropical qualities, and a little bit of that boozy quality did play into the overall acidity of this one. Florality level 4, and I do have to say once again, it's a little bit of those perfumey, heavier floral qualities to it. Can get a fair bit of violets. I'm trying to think back what the notes they have. I know that strawberry is one of them, and or purple grape makes a lot of sense. Stewed strawberries, melon, butterscotch, fruit tea. So nothing necessarily, I would say, in line with a lot of the boozy qualities that we did get outside of maybe the grape characteristic, but other than that, they don't have any floral notes listed on here. I can definitely see a lot of those heavier, more perfumey florals in this one as well. Berry fruit level 4. I feel like I didn't actually mention too many of the berry qualities, largely because I felt like that was a bit of a given when it came to this coffee. The primary characteristics in this one, outside of that strangely papery and slightly more fermenty quality, was the fact that the fermentiness was present in a berry sense, so I could definitely see a little bit of a wine-like characteristic, which is why the grape note makes a lot of sense. And in addition to that, the strawberries that they have, it's that slightly more heavy strawberry as opposed to a beautifully clean, fresh strawberry. So those things definitely play a role in the berry fruit being higher. But again, berry fruit, sweetness, and finish are all at a level 4, which isn't always the case for more processed coffees overall. Handful of level 3s. We will start with the spice level 3. That was an interesting one. There's a pretty interesting spiced characteristic to it, so that gave it, I would say, just a little bit more depth. Citrus fruits level 3. I mentioned there's a lot of tropicality to this coffee, even if it isn't necessarily an overly defined tropical characteristic. Then I'm thinking about it, that berry quality could also be associated with a slight bit of a kiwi characteristic. But the citrus fruit, I can definitely see a little bit of a pineapple, mostly an unripened pineapple, given the strong brightness to it. Stone fruits, I can definitely see the heavier stone fruits. I can see a little bit of that mango-like characteristic. And then we also have the chocolate pretty high, level 3. And I would say, a little surprised by how abundant that was, but it's definitely a little bit more of that robust, darker chocolate, which can come from slightly more developed coffees. Caramel level 3. Probably my favorite aspect of this coffee was that slight butterscotch-like quality, so that we put there at the level 3. Two final things we're discussing. We have the body at the level 3, and this one definitely had plenty of texture. I feel like when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You have a more processed coffee brewed with the V60 and a little bit more development. So for all those reasons, having a little bit higher of a body, even with it being a Panamanian geisha, makes a lot of sense. And then the last two things we're discussing, we have the cleanliness, and I just wanted to add the smokiness to it real quick because it's been one of the focal points of this review that this coffee isn't necessarily the lightest coffee out there. I feel like maybe saying a little bit lighter of a medium is probably a bit of a stretch, but I can see how a lot of people would find this coffee to be a lot further developed than what they would usually drink. So that's why the smokiness is there at the level 3 or level 1. 2. It did play a slight impact in the overall cleanliness, but this coffee never really had potential of scoring higher than that level 3, largely because of just how much fermentiness and heaviness there was. Though towards the end, given we were able to tone down that rum characteristic, that boozy characteristic, 3 felt like the ideal place to put it. So yeah, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It definitely did resemble the other experiences that we've had with this coffee roaster up to this point, and I feel like it's pretty safe to say that their profile just isn't necessarily in line with my own preferences, which is a little unfortunate given that they do offer some very interesting coffees. As mentioned, as of this moment, we've only ever reviewed this specific coffee from one other coffee roaster, and the Wesson Copia review we have of this coffee was also a little strange, so again, it could just be that I don't necessarily enjoy this specific coffee, but given I had the same issues with this one that I had with the other Red Meow coffees we reviewed, just a little bit more developed than I would necessarily like, I feel like it's pretty safe to say that the profile of this coffee roaster just isn't necessarily my sort of thing, which is fine. They do offer some very interesting coffees, so I feel like it could definitely appeal to a lot of people, which is translate into the type of person that I would suggest this coffee to. If you do like a little bit more development to your higher end coffees, then this one has that, because I do believe the only coffees I've ever seen them offering, or at least the only coffees that were ever offered to us from this coffee roaster, were higher end coffees. So you can definitely get a interesting mix. The Los Chinizos coffees, I feel like Red Meow was one of the very few and early coffee roasters I'd seen offering those coffees as well. So that was a unique coffee. This one, again, I don't think I've seen an American coffee roaster carrying this coffee. So if you kind of want to see what they would translate to when you are having a little bit more development to your Panamanian geishas, then this would make for an interesting experience. This coffee definitely did have some unique qualities, including that candied characteristic. So there's a bit more to it as well. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Catalina Auromar Natural Processed Panama from Red Meow Coffee Roastery. Thank you for watching.